If you're driving on Route 6 east of Towanda, the county seat of Bradford County, you'll eventually come across a historic marker proclaiming Marie Antoinette's Lookout. From there you can look out across a picturesque valley below. There's a flat area surrounded by hills and the Susquehanna River, and you might wonder, when did Marie Antoinette come here, and what's Pennsylvania's French connection? France and the United States have shared a lot of history, and this is particularly true with regards to western Pennsylvania, much of which constituted France's claims on the New World until the conclusion of the French and Indian Wars. Until that time, French forts spread out from Lake Erie following the French Creek and Allegheny River. There was the fort at Presque Isle in Erie, LeBoeuf in Waterford, Machal in Franklin, and Duquesne, where the Pittsburgh's three rivers meet. A decade after the conclusion of the French and Indian War, the government in Paris would assist the funding of the Americans' revolution against England. Some might argue that the financial aid to the foreign colonists helped to inspire outrage among the struggling people of France and lead to their own revolution at the close of the 18th century. France and the United States have a complicated relationship, and just as the true story of the American Revolution is very much a story of a divided opinion, and not just divided between those for or against rebelling, but there was also a significant number of people who were indifferent, living too much in the frontier to be much concerned one way or another. And this is true about western Pennsylvania in particular, but that's kind of another story. Anyhow, as France supported us, so too did members of the charter documents of the United States, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine, the latter of whom would come to regret that a bit later and would cause a division between the Whigs. The newly formed United States of America was still in its infancy, with George Washington in his first 4-year term in office, and that's when the reign of terror starts getting underway in France. The French revolutionaries are putting anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution on trial, and more often than not, onto the guillotine. The enemies of the revolution were members of Louis XVI's court, as well as members of the aristocracy. Many had helped argue for and raise capital for the American cause. And unrest was occurring elsewhere in the French Empire, as a slave revolt was stirring in Saint-Domingue, led by General Toussaint Louverture, whose troops would eventually defeat Napoleon's army and establish an independent nation of Haiti. And that's where we come back to Marie Antoinette's Lookout. As you stand off Route 6 and look down, there's a river valley with a large clearing on the flat area beside a sharp bend in the Susquehanna River. With the right eyes, you can imagine how a town would sit on that spot far below. In response to the violence in the French Empire, some significant people in the United States took it upon themselves to establish an asylum for the French aristocrats and others deemed enemies of the Revolution, hence the town's name, French Asylum. Though it was probably just called Asylum back then. Maybe not, I don't know. Financed in large part by American banker and Declaration signer Robert Morris, French Asylum starts in the summer of 1793, when 1,600 acres of land was purchased and several hundred acres were cleared of timber and to make cottages. A town was laid out in a grid and had a large centralized town square. The exiles began arriving in autumn of 1793, and at its height there were between 30 or 50 buildings in town. Aside from family homes, there were churches and a theater, schools, a small industry, and a population just over 100 strong. Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were, it is said, planning on escaping to the safety of the Pennsylvania hills. Some wonder if this isn't a far-fetched apocryphal story, but it should be noted that a large house, or in French, the Grande Maison, was erected with the intention of housing the royals. And though neither Louis nor Marie lived in the house, the future king, Louis Philippe, stayed in Azilum while still the Duke of Orleans. The town only lasted about 10 years. This is due in part to its domestic financial backers pulling out, as Robert Morris, and a partner had recently declared bankruptcy. The changing political climate of France, including Napoleon's offer to repatriate French exiles living throughout Europe and the New World, also played a big factor. However, some families stayed, most notably the Laporte family. Jean Laporte was born to French exiles living in French asylum in Pennsylvania in 1798. Among other notable things, Jean Laporte was born to French exiles living in French asylum, Pennsylvania in 1793. Among other notable things, he served as Speaker in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and was later elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. The town of LaPorte in Sullivan County is named after him, and he is buried in a small family cemetery near a house he built just outside of the site of Azilum in 1836. The LaPorte house still stands and is now open to tourists. Years ago, I read an article out of some Philadelphia paper about how the town of Towanda, which is about the closest thing near the former site of French Asylum, the town of Towanda celebrated Bastille Day, the French equivalent to the 4th of July. But in a rare example of having realized they missed the point, the festivities died down a bit, and I don't think they continue at all anymore, because keep in mind, some of the people that lived in Azilum were members of King Louis XVI's court, and it would kind of be like Prince Charles lighting off fireworks and Brandywine. And sure, the United States relationship with England has improved a good bit over the years, but I just don't think it's sporting. So if you're ever in Bradford County, which, just a side note, at the time was still known as Ontario County, if you're out that way and you're on Route 6, I would take the time to look at French Asylum and remember a time when a newly formed nation who had risen to the challenge in spite of a monarchy and really in rebellion to a monarchy kind of embraced another one, at least one that was fleeing its own revolution, and that's Pennsylvania's French Connection. As always, if you have any photographs or questions or just want to shoot a line, feel free to email us at drpennsylvania@gmail.com.